Tom Goodwin, you've written a fantastic book, I must say. Digital Darwinism. It's been a really good read. I really enjoyed it. And
Thank you.
thank you for taking the time to interview. One thing I noticed with your book is there's so many quotables. You've got some phenomenal quotes in here.
That's
I'm,
very
I-
kind of you to say.
I'm,
I felt very aware that I was taking up people's time when I was writing it, so I wanted to make sure that it was as kind of memorable and as interesting and as tweetable as possible. So I'm glad that you felt that way.
oh yeah, I'm going to go to town on this afterwards and be bubbling all sorts of stuff up in social media. So
Great.
there's a lot of stuff in this book that's very profound. I'm just going to bubble up some of these quotes because some of them made me just laugh out loud because they're really kind
Yeah.
of cheeky profound in a distinctly British way. And so one of the things you said was our big problem in life isn't scarcity, it's abundance.
I think, I mean, we just live at an amazing time. And by we,
Yeah.
I mean, I am aware that I'm being kind of obnoxious in my assumption of privilege. So the kind of audience of the book is expected to be people that are living, in relatively sort of developed nations and with decent healthcare and with decent internet access. So I think if you make the assumption that the readers are likely in that situation, the reality is that we don't get bored. Our biggest decision is what not to watch more than what to watch. We live in an era where we can access every single Oscar-winning film probably for free, probably immediately, probably in 4K resolution on any screen around us. And we choose not to because there are other things that we think of as being more interesting at a particular moment in time. So yeah, we kind of have too much of everything, whether it's too much food, too many choices, in some cases, too many friends that we can't really keep in contact with enough. And I think that's an interesting mindset to have because that's not how we were built. As a species, we were built to store food in our bodies and to, crave intelligence and connectivity. And actually, we don't need that anymore.
So
Yeah.
coming back to that question of abundance, and I know you don't like predicting the future, but um, how do you think that might change? Do you think technology might evolve to actually help us with this problem of choice, too much choice, choice overload, and abundance of content to consume?
I think absolutely. I think I get quite critical of the nature of Silicon Valley and the degree to which it's working on problems which are quite sort of non-core, non-human problems. They keep on making things possible that actually people don't want, whether they're connected juicers or whether they're, different types of drones or something. There's a lot of creation of things that are not necessary. At the same time, there are lots of businesses that I wish were set up, and anything that's about us making it easier to find quality content or quality experiences or quality music or quality friendships. I just think there's an incredible opportunity for companies to help us make these decisions. So whether it is something that allows you to find ballet and book a ticket more quickly, or to find a great new restaurant that's opened up, or to keep in contact with some friend that you don't normally sort of remember that they exist or something, and anything that can help sort of aid decision making and curation, I think is an incredibly important and profitable company to set up.
So let's home in on that people aspect. So you said,
Yeah.
you touched on social networking and really that there should be ways for people to be able to get introduced more effectively.
Yeah.
So I mainly work with internet dating companies, and we just learned that Facebook is entering
Yeah.
the dating industry
Yeah.
explicitly, creating an app, a distinct kind of messenger-esque app for dating. So I'm going to have to ad lib. Basically, you say that it's okay for Google and Amazon to have more data, but you just didn't think it was going to fly for Facebook for some reason. Um, why Facebook? Why is it okay for Google and Amazon, but not
Yeah.
okay for Facebook?
I mean, these things are not sort of binary where there's suddenly a line between right and wrong.
Yeah.
I think, as a general rule of thumb, I think we have issues as a whole with trust with a company like Facebook. I think it's not right for me to talk about it too much in my position in a media agency, but the value of Amazon, I think, and the value of Google is that we have known for a long time that they appear to be decent at using our data. They often appear to use it in a way which is helpful to us. Whether it's their ability to store credit card details without being hacked, or whether it's their ability to monitor our location to allow us to see what real-time traffic conditions are. I just think there's a lot of value that we seem to get in return. Most of our kind of recent memories of Facebook are not quite like that. So whether it's Cambridge Analytica, whether it's news being given to us that supports our current point of view because that's more easy for us to read. I just see slightly more negative results of Facebook having our data. It's not to say it's an evil company. It's not to say that they can't change that. But at this precise moment in time, it's not a company that people have a particularly good relationship with generally.
So I'm going to have to play devil's advocate on this one because ultimately I can't help thinking that this will pass. That there's a huge influx of press because this is a fantastic story. You have this company on one hand. The press love antithesis stories, right? So the one side of the story is that Facebook is evil because they've shared data and they've got a ton of flack in the press. On the other hand, I can't help thinking that the reality is the majority of people implicitly trust Facebook to an incredible extent because of the sheer utility and the sheer goodness of what they do in bubbling up fantastic content. Granted, myopic, they create huge myopia, but isn't the reality shown through the behavior of the usage patterns, the continued usage of Facebook? Doesn't that point towards people really trusting Facebook more than ever? You point to kind of three classes of people in the book. There's a class of people that kind of to ad lib, that are more the introverts that are kind of crippled by privacy. They just don't get why people share anything on Facebook and don't really want to. And then there's kind of a class that are aware of it, probably, more the kind of generation we're in. And then there's the youngsters who they are the 14-year-olds that are not aware of being offline because it just doesn't happen. They're online constantly. This concept of privacy isn't something they've ever been concerned about because they're not so concerned about safety, because don't we live in the most safe time of all time, according to Steven Pinker? But the reality probably is that people are just happy and hunky-dory users of Facebook now and for the long term, and Facebook dating could be a great concern to us in the internet dating industry. So that's a kind of a long diatribe, but ultimately, just wanted to come back. Is that really true? I wanted to question that.
I think, working in advertising, there is this assumption somehow that people think about this stuff all the time. And I think that most normal people are not massively concerned about their privacy, and they're not massively informed about it either. Yeah. So I think up until this point in time, we've never really had many people asking these questions or being aware of the implications of this data. I think it's certainly the case that the press has been quite unfair with Facebook. They've chosen to make this an issue because it's in their interest to try and beat down what is effectively someone who's come along and stolen all of their lunch. So they've got every reason to be unfair on Facebook, and they've kind of have been unfair. But I think it's more important to look ahead to the future. And I see a concept which I'm calling privacy trading, where we can have a much more progressive and open and informed discussion about privacy, with everyone being part of that discussion. And companies like Facebook have done a good job of tiptoeing around the edge and using dark pattern design theory to make sure that people can't change their settings that easily. They've taken more data than people think they've taken. They've sold it not sold it, but they've used it in more profitable ways than people have realized. So the kind of tonality of how they've used it has been somewhat sort of secretive and sort of murky. And I think now is the time to have a much more progressive, forward conversation about it, where we maximize what we get in return for that data. So I'm quite happy for Google to know where I am at any moment in time. If they could tell my credit card company, that would be great, because it would mean that my credit card transactions wouldn't be declined every time I go to Colombia. If my car rental company could see that I'm still at the airport and my flight hasn't taken off yet, and to keep the desk open for longer because I'm not going to be there on time, that's also a great thing. If my gym is able to see what food I've eaten that day and they can give me a more accurate breakdown of my calorific intake, that would be great as well. So I think as long as we trust these companies, as long as they're clear with what they're intending to do with it, as long as we still own the data, and as long as we get something in return for it, I think we might actually see a completely different attitude towards privacy, where we start getting much more, just doing more with it that's helpful for more people. Even the value of our attention would increase if companies had more data. So you can imagine a situation where you get served fewer but more valuable and more relevant advertising. And actually, that's probably a good thing for everyone.
It seems like we're in this funky ground in between incredible utility for advertising and targeting and kind of It's just not quite there yet, ultimately. Like you
Yeah,
say, you made an awesome example in the book. You said that, there's no worse time for someone to spring an ad on you than after the moment that you've bought that pair of white trousers and then they
yeah,
show you a picture of a pair of
yes,
white trousers in an advertisement. There's no worse time to spring that ad on you. So
yeah.
it kind of points to this strange place that we're in. I was thinking that advertising could become advertising as a service, right? I mean, if it was that good that we really
Absolutely.
got the targeting right, it would be
I mean, I
useful.
think the concept I introduced in the book is this idea of the mid-digital age, which is this time where we've kind of discovered the internet, but we haven't rebuilt around it. There will be a period of time, maybe 10 years, 20 years time, where we've had the internet and connectivity, and mobile devices for so long that we have constructed new paradigms and we've constructed new companies and business processes around that reality. But at the moment, generally speaking, most of the world that we experience are companies that have adapted to this world. They've kind of added technology around the edge. Whether it's airlines where they have an app that's supposed to tell you when the flight's boarding, but 90% of the time it doesn't work. Whether it's hotels that lose your booking if you just happen to have used a certain browser one day. We've got all of these companies that are really struggling under the weight of change. And most of them probably need to sort of rebuild themselves. Most of them probably need to take new software and new consumer expectations and new processes to the very core of what they do. But instead, they're trying to iterate around the old. We see that in every industry. So whether it is transportation, whether it's banking, whether it's insurance, whether it's retail, whether it's advertising, in my line of work, I see lots of people trying to kind of fit the future into the past. So they're using old-fashioned metrics to try and measure success. They're using old tactics that don't work anymore. So there will be a point in time when we get it all right, but we're not there yet.
So
Yeah.
it seems like there's an internal struggle in somewhat. You kind of the old school versus new school. It kind of builds nicely into a question from Amit Manoka,
Okay.
HBS PLD, and he says, as every business/function gets impacted with the digital revolution, there's a cultural divide in organizations with traditional management teams and a new age digital team. So
Yeah.
he asked, what's your advice to organizations and leaders to integrate these two diverse cultures of new versus old? What are some of your advice to make
I mean,
that
it's a
work?
killer question. I mean, it really goes to the heart of everything that we experience now, and most companies, you can feel this tension between change versus relying on what's worked before. I think we need to understand the situation a bit more clearly than this, because I think it's easy to presume that everyone who's older than 45 doesn't know what the internet is, and they don't know how to send email, and they can't do double clicks on the mouse. And that's just not true. I mean, the reality is that most people in business now, 99.9% of people know how to send an email and how to buy a mobile phone, and they understand enough. I think the difficulty is that those that tend to be older, generally speaking, they're trying to sort of hang on to what they have. So the people that are most senior in organizations, almost by definition, are older. Almost by definition, they've got less time to see the benefit of any changes that they make. They are probably likely to have more, assets to their name and more things to lose and kids to put through university and all sorts of barriers for risk taking. So I actually think the big cultural divide that we see isn't so much this sort of digital divide. It's more of a divide between young people that are thrusting, that are trying to make a name for themselves, that are trying to get promoted, that are on the up, and people that are probably managing those people that are risk averse and they don't necessarily see the upside to making big risky decisions. So when you're faced with that, you realize that actually it's a slightly different problem you have to solve. It's way less about inspiration around what technology allows. It's way less around information and education, and it's actually much more about change management and cultural change and things like that.
Yeah. And actually, let me ask Lisa Hughes' question as well. She's PLD Portfolio Director at HBS, and she says, our forebears who lived in a world lit only by sunlight and fire could not have imagined the world lit with electricity. And you do have some wonderful example in the book where you kind of walk through the story of how electricity develops, and it really helps with the mindset of reading the book, I must say, of this kind of digital transformation now versus the move to electricity. I mean, it's a long
Yeah.
time coming. But she asked, um, But even still, we have not outgrown our need for sunlight and fire. Can a compass be useful, she asks, in a world where we have GPS, metaphorically and broadly speaking?
That's a really interesting question. It's quite hard not to take that question literally and talk about compasses. I think it's about the best tool for the job. I think the reality is that the tech press like to talk about everything as if everything new is the best and everything old is dead. And often life is not that simple. I mean, specifically when you look at media, there's not been a single form of media that is now extinct, other than perhaps the telegram. You know, we still listen to radio, we still read newspapers, we still get mail. All of these things that technology was supposed to kill off, it has not. Even things like digital book sales, you know, they're still not quite what people expected them to be. People just like turning pages.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, it's not about nostalgia. It's just about the realization that everything has its place and its time. And most of the things from the past are still around. You know, self-driving cars may be a much more efficient way to drive around, but people like driving. You know, people wake up on a Sunday and they enjoy the act of sort of burning around the countryside. So more than anything else, I think to understand the potential of technology in the future, you need to just be highly empathetic, and you need to understand that at our very core, we are human, and we still shake each other's hands to show that we're not carrying weapons. We still cheers our drinks together to show that we're not poisoning each other. You know, in this age where Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter and Google seem to change everything in the last 10 years, like fundamentally in our core, we're still the same sort of prehistoric you know, creatures that sort of came out of the, you know, the swamp. So,
And you do actually. One of the things I love about your book is the examples that you give. You paint a picture wonderfully with numerous examples. One of the examples that I'm surprised to hear about is that this year in Tanzania they'll be kicking off the first drone delivery service, and that's called. There's a company called Zipline, and they're delivering blood transfusion, blood basically for medical emergencies, etc. So it seems like the point that really makes is that leapfrogging. I think you used the word leapfrogging,
yeah,
and there's some advantages in a place like Tanzania because they can leapfrog the old and go straight to this new form of delivery because it's
yeah,
just far more efficient and they're not encumbered. I think it's a
no,
key word that in disruption is you talk about self-disruption.
yeah.
Oh God, my favorite quote from the entire book, just nestling in one paragraph quietly, was this quote, which I will never forget. Self-disruption is like seeing a therapist when most patients would rather have a boob job. Can we unpack that, please? Love that quote.
I forgot about that line. I think, yeah. I mean, we just want an easy, quick, and immediate, and cheap and superficial solution to everything. And you know, the press every day is full of retailers that are shutting stores left, right, and center that come up with a new AR app that allows you to, you know, find special offers more quickly in store. And actually, they just need to, you know, rebuild their entire company probably with new distribution centers. You know, or some dying pizza chain will allow you to order pizza by drone or something. I think, you know, the scary truth is that not every company is screwed, but there are certain sectors and certain companies that are totally screwed and they need to make significant changes. And the beautiful thing about the leapfrog effect is it allows companies to go from kind of last place to first place in one big swoop. You know, Chinese e-commerce is, you know, one of the fastest growing in the entire world, and I think it's the second biggest by value in the entire world. And the entire reason it is able to be so big is because they didn't invest in the midway stage, where they had that many shopping malls or the same culture of high street shopping as you see in the UK or the US. And so this ability to kind of go from having no trains to the very fastest trains, or no banking system to a mobile banking system, or no roads to drones only. There's a sort of fantastic dynamic that can happen when you're not invested in the dying paradigm that we see currently. And I think that's quite an inspirational lesson for most companies.
Is it newer companies that can really transform? I mean, IBM is one of the companies that you quote. I mean, that's an age-old, relatively age-old company that managed to
Yeah,
make a huge transition to kind of consulting and services. And you love the example of Netflix. That's your favorite
yeah.
example.
I mean, it's more that as I go around the world and I talk about change and I talk about the abilities of companies to self-disrupt and to make significant changes to the company. And people talk about the metaphor of kind of changing the engines on the plane while it's flying, or pick your own choice. Um, there are very, 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 very few examples of companies that have actually done this. Most companies seem to prefer to manage the decline quite slowly, and to do so in a way which was justifiable and never changed trajectory too much. They seem to prefer to do that than want to make the significant changes they need to in order to kind of right the ship. So if you are a department store, I just don't really see how you can exist in 15 years' time, because the entire purpose and role of department stores in our lives is now taken away. If you're a magazine publisher, the reality is that you're not going to be in the business of printing glossy brochures much longer. You're going to have to completely think about the way that you create content in a different way. And most companies are not prepared to do this, because within it there lies the acceptance that they made bad mistakes and that they chose the wrong option. So we see very, very, very few examples of companies that change course dramatically. Netflix is pretty much, one of, maybe 3 or 4 examples. IBM could be another one. Boeing could be another one. General Electric to some extent. But other than that, you don't see this. Probably a more palatable thing to do is companies to set up the units that take over themselves, but to do so in a subtle way which doesn't get the attention of the city.
Like
So companies
IAC with Tinder.
like IAC, yeah. I mean, that's an extremely good example. So the question becomes, what is the the relationship between Tinder and IAC? What does that look like for Condé Nast? What does that look like for Fox News? What does that look like to BMW? What does that look like to American Airlines? And that's a fantastic brief, I think, for people to work on. In some cases, it's kind of there. I mean, BMW set up this unit called iSeries, which is kind of their equivalent of Tinder. But most companies have not done this. Most companies would rather buy innovation. So Unilever would rather buy Dollar Shave Club than they would make it. Nordstrom's would rather buy Trunk Club rather than make it. And that doesn't make much sense to me.
You touched on retail, and we know retail's in the doldrums by and large, but you show some hope for retail and some distinction. You're not a fan of Amazon, it seems. And the simplicity of Amazon, it's just not a very delightful experience, ultimately, I think you said in the book. But you said that real world retail is experiential. There's opportunity through that experience to stand out from digital. Could we go down that path?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. For me, retail is probably going to bifurcate into 2 different directions. So you're either making an experience which is delightful and memorable, and contains joy, and it's something that you might do if you're bored, and that can be physical or it can be digital still. So there's an app from Nike called Nike Tech Book, which is a very sort of tactile and immersive, 3-dimensional, content-rich catalog, where actually it's conceivable that you might be sufficiently bored on a Saturday morning that you would just start browsing through it. But Amazon certainly isn't that. Like, we've never been so bored that we just type in, random items into Amazon and see what's there. So we either make it beautiful and rich and immersive and experiential, or we go the other way, which is to make it so simple that we don't remember doing it. Hotel Tonight, I think, does a fantastic job of letting you book a hotel without thinking about it. Kayak is a very boring way to buy a flight, but that's what you want when you buy a flight. Amazon fits into this category. When I am critical of it, it's more that there is this assumption that because it might be the world's first trillion-dollar company, that it must do everything perfectly, and that every company that's in that space should just look at it and try and emulate everything it's done because it's clearly the best site the world will ever know. And I just don't think that's true. I think it's actually quite complicated to buy some things from it. It has great customer service and its logistics back end is pretty impressive. But actually, if you ever try and buy a TV from it or a pair of socks or something, it can be quite nightmarish.
Tom, have you ever walked into a bookshop and found the book that you wanted and then opened up the phone, found it on Amazon, and bought it. Isn't that kind of at the heart of the problem with retail? Is they've
Yeah, I
not
mean,
got
I do.
digital in the store?
Probably half the time I do that, and half the time I don't, and it all depends on how sort of morally obliged I feel.
Yes.
Um, it's certainly an issue. The solution is for the bookstore to probably make it easier to go
Yeah.
between that book and their own store.
Yeah. Really.
So QR codes always had quite a bad rap for being a clumsy solution, but actually with things like artificial intelligence driven image recognition, it would be pretty easy for you to walk into a Walkerstones, take a picture of the front cover, and for it to seamlessly link you to a website, auto-populate your credit card details, auto-populate your address details, use your Face ID or Touch ID and buy it, and it be delivered immediately. So often the problem is not so much that Amazon is cheaper. The problem is that people perceive it to be the easiest way to buy something.
Yeah. And you actually touch on another technology which I'd not heard of before, called Chirp. So even simpler than the QR code. I think you basically said it was like a audible QR code.
Yeah,
It sounds like R2D2 basically. So
that's
maybe they
exactly
could
what it
use that
sounds
in
like.
store. You press the button, you hear the code, and then the order's on the way.
I think the main thing is, this comes down to a way that we need to think about the internet that is different to how we currently think of it. The world is obsessed with the fact there is the online world and the offline world, and it's as if we still behave in the way that we once did, where you go home and you get bored and you decide to surf the internet and you unplug the phone from the socket and you listen to the sort of dial-up music of the internet and you do the thing you wanted to do, and then you get off the internet. The modern reality is that the internet is rather like electricity. Like, it's extremely important, but we never think about it. In fact, we only ever notice electricity when there's a power cut. And similarly, we only ever notice the internet when we can't get access to it. So we don't talk about electrical retail. We don't talk about electrical strategy. We don't talk about electrical commerce. It's just buying stuff in a world where electricity exists. And I think we need to think about the internet in the same way. We don't need global heads of electricity, and we don't need global heads of digital either.
I think that was the most profound thing that I picked up from the book, is that 14-year-olds never think about being offline.
Yeah.
Like 30, 40 somethings and beyond. We think of being online, offline. They're just ambient connectivity. That's the phrase that you used.
Yeah.
That was a real penny drop moment.
Yeah. I mean, it applies to all sectors, really. I mean, I think banks probably talk about their mobile strategy, and it's actually just a banking strategy. When you do banking on the mobile, you do not think, oh, wow, today I'm going to go on a mobile app and do some banking. You just think, oh, I owe Dave some money, I should give him some. So whether it's banking, whether it's retail, whether it's video, I don't think people watch TV on their phones. They just watch the stuff they love on their phones, and sometimes it's TV. Dating is another example. Going back to sort of your area.
Yeah.
I don't think people talk about online dating anymore. They just talk about dating.
Interesting, yes.
Yeah, and as it happens, for 99% of dates in New York, the thing that's made it happen has been the internet. But that's not a particularly interesting fact. So
you actually go through many examples in the book, and one of the couple that you didn't mention, which I thought you'd really enjoy, is Fair for buying cars short term. Really interesting, entirely digital model. So you can buy a car on a cell phone, go pick it up, and you can have it for as long as you want. You pay a certain down payment, and then you can have it month to month for 3 or 4 months. And Revolut, we're getting back to banking. Do you know of Revolut?
I've not heard of them, no.
Really interesting what they're doing with.
Make a note. Yeah.
Yeah, check out Revolut. They've just come to the USA, and it's entirely on the phone. You can have a card. It's a debit card, but there's a bank attached to it. You can buy travel insurance. Really pretty renegade in the way that they're dealing with banking and debit cards. So,
I mean, my favorite question in the whole book was on the first page, which was basically saying, if you were to set up your company today, what would it look like? And I think, things like HSBC is what happens when you're staffed with bankers and they know how to do banking brilliantly, and they kind of begrudgingly accept that the world has changed. And this company, Revolut, by the sound of things, this is what happens when a group of people sit together in a pub and go, what would a bank look like if we made it now? Like, you actually wouldn't need the branches, would you? And if you didn't have the branches, I guess you wouldn't need to make as much money from upselling people to insurance policies. And if you weren't going to do insurance policies, you could focus really on what a current account is about, which is about paying your friends and paying cleaners and, investing money in a way where you feel like you've got control. And you end up in a completely different place to what a bank actually looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the future looks rosy. Tom, Tom Goodwin, you're the author of Digital Darwinism. I don't often reread books, but I'll tell you, I'm going to reread this one. It's awesome. Actually, I'll probably listen to it. Do you have an Audible yet?
I'm in discussions about doing that.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right. Well, hopefully you're on Audible. I think it'd be good to consume it from a different channel as well. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, Tom.
My pleasure. It's been great having me on. Thank you.